A few months ago, I attended a meeting of interfaith clergy. We met at a restaurant overlooking the water, and we did the standard go-around to introduce ourselves. We ordered some lunch, and then, the small chit-chat conversations began. Oh, how long have you been at your church? What did you do before you moved to this area? How were things at the synagogue? And then came the question, and I have to tell you that I was not prepared. Rabbi, how do you feel about the war? This is a question so many of us have received over the course of this last year. It may have been phrased slightly differently, and it may have been not articulated at all. But the world seems to have lined up along the fault lines of this question, and everywhere we look, we're presented with it. How do I feel about the war? This question goes to the heart of the Jewish experience of the last year, and really to the core of what it means to be a Jew. Because the question beneath this question is this: do you care only about your fellow Jews in this war, or does your compassion perhaps extend to the suffering of others, to Palestinian civilians, and in the last week, to Lebanese civilians? And if we push the question even further, it could be getting at, can you separate your loyalty and your connection to the Israeli people from the decisions that the Israeli government and the military are making? Now, friends, I don't know exactly how the last year has gone for each one of you, but I have a feeling we've all been struggling with a version of this question, whether asked directly to us or not. Somewhere along the way, our 76-plus year loyalty to the modern state of Israel has become something of a liability, a political litmus test where there used to be none. Somewhere in there, the narrative of Israel as modern miracle, Israel as the internationally granted home of the Jewish people, has been supplanted by that of Israel as colonizer, Israel as occupier, Israel as oppressor. And while these ideas are certainly not new in the last 12 months, they certainly have come to the fore, including throughout our country, and especially, as so many of our young people here can attest, on college campuses. There's no way to sugarcoat the dynamics in our country and throughout the world. As with so many aspects of our lives and societies, this is a polarizing issue. And frankly, it is scary to see passions so inflamed, anger burning so fiercely, and words of protest threatening. Now you see, even as I try to describe the socio-political dynamics, I see myself falling to one side of the line. My lifelong orientation, you know this about me, has been to support Israel, like many of you. And what I'm really doing when I describe this is picturing pro-Palestinian protesters, anti-Israel demonstrations. I can barely manage to step outside of my own corner of this conflict. But in order to make room for a vision of a more peaceful future, I think that's precisely what we must begin to do. And so on this first day of the new year of 5785, I ask a different question for us to ponder. How do we want to relate to the current situation in the Middle East? How much room is there for expanded compassion? And what does that look like? And what wisdom does our tradition offer us in such a trying and unprecedented time? I want to offer two notes here. The first is obvious, but I have to say it. This topic is really, really, really difficult. We all have emotional responses to this conversation, and I want to make sure that each of us knows that there is room in this congregation and room in this sanctuary, room through the live stream for your feelings and for the feelings of your fellow congregant who may in fact be sitting right next to you. There has to be. We're all in this together. And the second note, I'm not focusing in this moment on Hamas or on Iran, but of course the reason that we're in this situation is because of their funding, their planning, carrying out of the attacks of October 7th, their placement of fighters and weapons among the civilian population in Gaza, and now, as we're learning, also in Lebanon. and their core, and their core belief that Israel and the Jewish people should not exist. I am working on the assumption that the civilian populations, although in Gaza they elected Hamas, do not all share the same beliefs about Israel and about Jews. Some may see that stance as naive. I get it. I do. I'm choosing to focus on tikva, on hope. So how do we want to relate to this awful and painful conflict? I'll start where I think most American Jews, although by no means all, are. When we think about the war, when we talk about the war, we're speaking about the suffering of the Israelis and of the world's Jews on and since October 7th. We're reflecting on the trauma of the unprecedented and unprovoked attack, the murder of 1,200 Israelis and foreign nationals, including Americans, and the abduction of 251 souls into Hamas's terror tunnels. We're still trying and failing to process the gruesome, systematic sexual violence they perpetrated against women and men. We're stuck in a seemingly endless, desperate journey of trying to get these hostages home, of learning about them, praying for them, connecting with them, to them and their families, and a tremendous sadness as we've learned of the terrible fate of so many. This war means supporting our Israeli friends and family who are living with sirens and rockets and intensified northern front against Hezbollah and now against Iran itself, and evacuations and fear for their lives, who are fighting in active duty and reserve duty for months and months on end, and the traumatic toll that's taking on them and on us. We're experiencing ourselves closer to home, and sometimes even in some of our own yards, the surge in anti-Semitic slurs and actions. And we're struggling with the anti-Israel encampments on many college campuses as we put our college students, our amazing, brilliant, ready to go, capture the world college students on the front lines of a battle they're ill-prepared for. This experience is real. We don't need the umpteen proof texts from the Torah or the Talmud to tell us that when our family is under fire, we pull together. I know I walk around daily with this entire worldview. I deepen it with my news feeds, my social media, and even with the prayers that I myself select for our entire community to read together. And I also know that's not enough. Let me share some Torah to shift the perspective. Here are two teachings from Rabbi Shai Held, author of a new book called Judaism is About Love. Here's the first. There's a well-known feature in the Torah that it commands us no less than 36 separate times to love the stranger, ve'ahavtem et hager. Rabbi Held points out that the Torah looking out for the ger, the stranger, is actually an innovation compared to other societies who were around at the same time. Everyone looked out for widows and orphans. They were the most vulnerable people in the society. But the Torah chose to add the ger, the stranger. As Jews, we are obligated to protect and care for the ger just as much as we would our own family in need. Rabbi Held articulates the underlying value in the Torah. By including the ger in this group with widows and orphans, the Torah expands the category of people we must care about and care for to include anyone in any vulnerable situation. And the other teaching. We're familiar with Judaism's golden rule, ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's how it's usually translated. Rabbi Held teaches a radically different understanding of this verse, first articulated in the 12th century by Nachmanides in Spain. Based on the grammar of the verse, l'reacha, and not an alternative, et reacha, he asserts that the focus in this verse is on what we want for our neighbors. You shall love for your neighbor as you love for yourself. Wealth, good food, a great education, a lovely home, safety and security and good health, just to name a few. None of these is a zero-sum game. Care about and care for anyone in any vulnerable situation, and you shall love for your neighbor as you love for yourself. This is how I want to relate to the conflict in Israel and the region of the Middle East. When I received that question over the interfaith clergy lunch, I found myself stumbling through my personal experience of the last year while realizing in my head and feeling a little anxious about it that my conversation partners were looking for a signal that I cared about the suffering of Palestinian civilians too, about their desperate longing for a sovereign state. Of course I do. I've just been stuck in my corner of this conflict, and my conversation partners were stuck in their corner as well, as, dare I say, most of us are too. So although the conflict has escalated and changed quite a bit in the last few days, I want to share with you 3 glimpses, powerful glimpses, into a different perspective, into arenas of expanded compassion, where individuals and groups are striving to love their neighbor and for their neighbor as for themselves. Here's the first one. You may have seen this. Back in July, a group of Israeli and Palestinian teens performed on the stage of America's Got Talent. Who saw that? Jim saw it! Yes, go Jim! The Jerusalem Youth Chorus, which was founded over a decade ago, and which also performed live at last year's conservative movement convening in Baltimore, so I got to see them too, blew the audience away with their rendition of the song Home by Philip Phillips. It was so powerful. And when asked what they'd do if they were awarded $1 million, the answer was simple. They would create more spaces for Israelis and Palestinians to come together in dialogue and friendship, to create something beautiful and to dream together of a shared and just future. Yes, that's it. Also over the summer, a TED Talk was recorded at an historic event for peace held in Tel Aviv. The conversation partners there were 2 men, Maoz Inon, an Israeli entrepreneur, and Aziz Abu Sara, a Palestinian-American expert in conflict resolution. The 2 lead an organization, the Interact Education Center, which educates participants in the core value of dual narratives. Dual narratives. During this conversation, Maoz, the Israeli, shared this. I learned from my dialogue with Palestinians that we must forgive for the past, we must forgive for the present, but we must not forgive, I think what he meant to say was we must not give up on the future. Our stories meet. They meet in the future. And Aziz, whose older brother was killed by Israeli soldiers when he, Aziz, was just 10, shared this. If we must divide us, then divide us between those who believe in peace and resolution and those who don't, yet. I watched them talk together with everything they and their families have been through, and I'm awed at their ability to look to the future and to envision it differently together. Earlier this year, and much closer to home, I had the privilege of participating in a dialogue between Jewish and Muslim leaders through Connect, congregations organized for a New Connecticut, an interfaith social justice organization of which our Bethel has been a member for 6 years, Stuart? 6, 7, something like that. Now, I'll be honest, we were not nearly as integrated or polished in our conversation as the Jerusalem Youth Chorus or Maoz and Aziz. They've clearly had this conversation a lot of times. In our dialogue, we relied on an expert facilitator. We did a lot of prep work, and we all agreed to dialogue guidelines. I tried to share my experience and to receive everyone else's without judgment. I offered support and empathy for the suffering expressed by my Muslim counterparts, and I felt heartened to hear them condemn the October 7th attack and the ongoing hostage nightmare. They did that. We spent our time listening together to the experiences of other human beings, what we've felt over the last year, and what we've taken in from friends and family who are living through it every single day. And I will tell you, it was very challenging to uncover differences of opinion and different tellings of the same historical events, to be aware of potentially triggering words. But we really tried to put first the relationships we were working to build here. And I think that's the key. It was so important to have a space to speak together with Jews and Muslims who dream about and who pray for salam, for shalom, for peace. Their narratives are just as important as my own experiences. That's what I learned. Their narratives are just as important as my own experiences. And listening to them, being in relationship with them, expanding our compassion to include them, that's the way forward. I really wanted you to know about this dialogue. That's why I'm sharing it with you today. And if and when the opportunity comes for members of the Jewish and the Muslim communities to participate, I hope you might consider joining it yourself. Sometime over the last year, maybe in November, December, I tested out adding in a few new words when I say the Mishaberach prayer, when we pronounce the names of those in need of healing, like we did just a short while ago. At first, I added in the words, Kol Am Yisrael, the entire nation of Israel, obviously so desperate for healing. And soon I realized that I needed to add prayers for the civilian population in Gaza. Most of the year I've been saying Anshe Aza, whose lives are literally in danger each day of this war. Our Machzor, Lev Shalem, contains similar but more universal language. In each instance of Oseh Shalom B'Romav, it asks for peace al kol Yisrael ve'al kol Yoshvei Tevel, for all of Israel and for all who dwell on earth. At times I felt self-conscious to pray publicly for Palestinians for fear of backlash, but uttering these words is an act of expanding compassion, and it helps me to consider a wider perspective on human experience and human suffering. So I add these words every Shabbat morning, every holiday morning, this morning, tomorrow morning, and every time I attend morning minyan. And I hope you will consider adding those words to your prayers as well. The world, this conflict, this war, it's all so heavy right now. And today is a new year. I urge each of us, try on a wider perspective this year. Just try it on, see how it feels. Expand your compassion even a little bit. And don't give up on the future. Our stories will meet in the future, and we must begin to write them today. Shana Tova.